Hello and welcome to Stowe Talks, a podcast designed to support people going through a relationship breakdown and all the challenges this brings. I'm Matthew Taylor.
And I'm Liza, family lawyers at Stowe Family Law, and today we are joined by award-winning comedian and creator of global hit podcast and book The Breakup Monologues, Rosie Wilby, as we look at the unique challenges faced by the LGBTQI+ community during a separation or divorce. So welcome, Rosie, to the Stowe Talks podcast. It's lovely to have you with us today. Could you start by just introducing yourself to the listeners and giving a bit of background?
Well, absolutely. Thank you for that. Yes, I'm Rosie Wilby. I'm a comedian and podcaster, and I've been really a bit obsessed about breakups and endings and separation for many years, ever since I once got dumped by email, and I felt much better once I'd corrected her spelling. But yeah, sort of joking aside, I was really kind of struck by how completely uprooted we can feel when a long-term partnership ends. And in some ways, I've been especially interested in how that affects people within the LGBTQ community, because a lot of the literature, a lot of the sort of dusty old textbooks that have been out there in the past about relationships and how the brain works when we're in love and how the brain works when we then fall out of love or someone breaks up with us and breaks our heart, they're often written in a very heteronormative language, making heteronormative assumptions. In fact, some of them even say right at the beginning, oh, we'll assume that this book is about a relationship between a man and a woman, but we'll also assume that all relationships work in the same way. And I read that many, many times, and I thought I would like to start my podcast, which does talk to everybody. I talk to lots of straight people. I talk to old people, young people, gay people, bisexual people, trans people, non-binary people. I try to include as many different, I talk about cross-cultural relationships. I was just the other day hearing from Jambi McGrath about her Kenyan ancestors and how her I know how many greats were there. I think it was her great grandmother had 7 wives.
Wow.
And yeah, but then of course the British came along and got rid of all that and brought all the homophobia and traditional sort of very conservative rules. So yeah, it's interesting, all the different stories that I've heard about relationships and love and how different ways of thinking about it all, really. And I've been keen to really present my own story along with those of many, many other people and bring a little bit of fun to it as well, and a bit of a giggle, because when we're going through tough times, sometimes a bit of humour can help us through.
I think that's absolutely true. And so, without sounding too much like a fanboy, I'm a big fan of the podcast, the Breakup Monologues, and look at me, my absolute swat. Anyone on YouTube, I'm flashing Rosie's book here. And but before you did the Breakup Monologues, you did a book about monogamy, didn't you? And I wonder if that's a good sort of jumping off point to talk about your adventures in exploring monogamy. And is monogamy dead? That was the sort of the premise of the book, wasn't it?
Yes, and it's very much a question that I'm posing rather than, I'm not making any statements about monogamy being dead or otherwise. I think it's very much alive, but I think it is something that we can actively and consciously choose, as opposed to it being a sort of cultural default. There are lots of different ways of thinking about relationships, and I think within the queer community, I think because a lot of people have already thought outside the box about the sort of narrative that their romantic life is going to take, and they know that they're not necessarily going to follow the sort of traditional rom-com route of boy meets girl and so on. I think they're more open to thinking about polyamory or open relationships, even if you then think, actually, no, that's not for me, but maybe if you try it, you can make a more informed judgment, because every way of having relationships is complicated, but it's worth having these kind of discussions with a partner so you know exactly what your boundaries are, what your desires are, what your needs and wants are, and what someone might do that might hurt you. I mean, the book, that first book, Is Monogamy Dead, was largely based on an online survey I did asking what counts as cheating. And I think within the law and also within our culture broadly, we make sweeping assumptions that cheating means the same thing to everybody. Obviously, we used to have a legal definition of adultery. Things have changed now with no-fault divorce. But interestingly, even for gay couples, adultery still only counted when it was between opposite sex partners, which is really strange.
Really odd. We used to get that all the time in divorce petitions in the bonkers old system before the law changed. Is that you'd have a same-sex couple and say, well, I'll have an adultery petition, and you have to say, well, no, because that's not the way the law was phrased, because the laws dated back to 1973, or drafted in 1969, and at that time, clearly no one was going to, be factoring in the fact that there might be sort of same-sex relationships as adultery. I think the cheating thing's a really interesting point, and Lisa, you probably got a sort of view on this. The amount, again, we have no-fault divorce now, so it doesn't apply as much, but previously there'd be a lot of behaviour petitions that would include some form of cheating, and that cheating could often be emotional cheating. There was not necessarily, you'd have people come to you and say, look, I don't think there's been any physical relationship, but he or she is always texting. I mean, Lisa, is that something you saw a lot of?
Yeah, absolutely. And actually, sometimes they would say, do you know what, if they just had a one night stand, maybe that's something I could get over. But it's the ongoing emotional kind of connection that was there, that was often something that the relationship couldn't survive.
Yeah, that's so interesting, because I found in my survey, obviously things like having sex with someone else or kissing someone else rated the most highly, but falling in love with someone else without any sexual contact was very, very close behind those top options. Also, things like micro cheating, which is this umbrella term for lots of behaviours that are facilitated by the apps and the online world and social media, and you can sort of be flirting with somebody online and you could be keeping that a secret from your partner. And you're absolutely right, there's a whole category of people who probably could recover from their partner, like you say, having a more casual one night stand or a snog at a Christmas party or something like that. I mean, it would still be something that would most likely be hurtful within the framework that we tend to expect our relationships to play out. But yes, I think for many people, it's that emotional sense of a relationship developing that feels more like a betrayal. I think particularly for women, I think men are more threatened by sex, and I think men are more wired to feel threatened by their partner having sex with somebody else. But women, I think it is much more the emotional side of it that they would feel more hurt by.
I think that's right. I was quite junior at the time. I probably a couple of years qualified, maybe even only a year. And I was seeing a new client, and she came in and she started with, so we're swingers, obviously. And that obviously kind of made me sit back a little bit because, nothing about that was obvious. She said, we're swingers. And we've both been very happy with that for years. But my husband's now fallen in love with someone that we go swinging with. And that was a real kind of, and I don't know if I managed to hide and I'm sort of like very, very traditional, heteronormative kind of vanilla, like not involved in that world at all. I didn't have a clue. And, it was quite a shock as quite a junior solicitor, but it's really interesting. It really made me think about, the different lines that someone classifies as cheating. And that was the line for it. I could totally get it. I could totally understand it, that was the betrayal.
But I think that's quite common, isn't it?
Yeah.
That we think, when we think of cheating, we think of kissing and sex. Like that's what we think of as cheating. But actually, that's not necessarily what hurts us the most. It's that other behaviour that underlines it.
Absolutely. But the interesting thing is how do you police that? Like, how do you tell your partner, oh, you mustn't fall in love with anybody else? Because sometimes you don't have to have sex with somebody or physical contact with somebody. You might be working closely with somebody. Well, a lot of people now, there's a new term, isn't there? Having a work wife or a work husband, work spouse. So, there are people in other sections of our lives, other compartments of our lives that we do build close relationships with. And at what point does that stray into sort of romantic feelings, even if it doesn't develop into a sexual relationship?
Yeah, absolutely. It's difficult, and the point, I guess, the underlying point is relationships are complicated, and every relationship is different. So, I mean, maybe that's a good kind of segue to start talking a bit more detail about the LGBTQ plus community and about what you see. Maybe for those of us who aren't necessarily as gendered up with things, if you could give us a little bit of the history of the development of the community, and we can have a wider discussion about the particular challenges for that community of divorce and separation.
Yes, thank you. Well,
history lesson, off we go.
Yeah, I'm really intrigued by the two swingers that came in, and the fact that you didn't pick up whatever cues they thought they'd given off, perhaps when they threw their keys into your you had you hadn't watched the ice storm.
Yeah, I just panicked and run away, and didn't know what I was very out of my depth in life.
Wasn't there something about people putting sort of pampas grass outside the door?
Yeah. Is that not the original thing, the kind of like 1970s, 1980s home counties thing?
Yeah. So I don't know, whatever signals they were giving off, Matt, you clearly didn't read those.
Absolutely not.
So yeah, I think the LGBT community, obviously we've come from a very difficult place of exclusion and marginalisation, and that brings with it a whole raft of challenges. But also, and speaking as a woman who came out as a teenager in the 1980s, actually the most horrifically homophobic decade on record, if you look at data about what people's attitudes and opinions were, and then moved to London as a student in the 1990s. With that marginalisation and sort of inability to participate in the sort of normative, traditional way of having relationships came a certain set of freedoms. And you could reject the idea of marriage and the pressures of, you've got to have kids by the time you're X age, you've got to be married, you've got to be living together, you've got to, have 2.4 children and this job, this career. And there were a lot of people, myself included, who really embraced that in many ways, and the unconventional way of living and thinking about relationships differently, and creating strong friendship groups that almost became like your family. I mean, for many people, sadly, they might have become estranged from biological families, from parents, from aunts and uncles or grandparents, or sort of older relatives who perhaps had more traditional views and sadly weren't yet. I mean, many people's sort of older relatives have now come round, and we've seen a lot of people, eventually sort of come to a more peaceful place with parents and with older relatives who hadn't been able to accept them for a long time. But we do see a sort of replacement sort of family within the LGBT community, and strong friendship groups emerging. But also that plays out in interesting ways in how we separate when we have a romantic partnership end, because it tends to be that if you hang out in a small friendship group, you are probably going to still see your ex all of the time. So you've really got to stay friends. I mean, I always joke that you've got to be nice to your ex's 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 ex, because that actually turns out to be you. And so I believe that lesbians pioneered conscious uncoupling long before Gwyneth Paltrow sort of popularised the term. I mean, we didn't call it conscious uncoupling because we're not quite so pretentious. But it was the same kind of idea. And, you will often see gay women of my age and above whose absolute best friend, aside from their romantic partner, might be their ex-partner. And they might have their ex-partner come and house sit and feed all their 10 cats, because yes, some of those stereotypes are real. When they go on holiday, that might be the person they call on to come and look after their house, or something like that. And there are these sort of close network groups. When my wife and I went away recently, the people who came in house sat and looked after our pets were actually an ex of a good friend of my wife. So you do have these sort of very interconnected social groups within smaller communities like that. And so,
Do you think that still applies? Because you mentioned about, women of your age, you obviously come through the 80s and the 90s and the huge sort of societal change there. With, obviously there are still issues with stigma and discrimination, but with generally the society being a lot more progressive and accepting of LGBTQ relationships, do you think that's sort of slightly diminishing in the younger generation at all, or is that something that you still see from sort of younger friends of yours in younger groups, that there's still that kind of grouping and that kind of still hanging around and being mates with your ex?
I think there is still a lot of that, and I think it will always be strong within those communities. Obviously, the internet and the way we can socialize online and sort of connect with large numbers of people more remotely does sort of change things a little bit. And yeah, you can have sort of LGBT groups on Facebook, for example, and people can sort of socialize and get that interaction with the community in a different way. But I suppose even then, your ex is probably going to be a member of some of the same groups. So,
There's no escaping.
There's no escaping. There's no escaping.
I mean, I'm intrigued as to what the magic is. What's the secret? Obviously, Matt and I speak to people all the time who are going through breakups, and some manage it very successfully and some struggle, let's put it politely, with dealing with the separation. So, if there is something you can see there within that group that they're able to just do this better, what is it you think they're doing differently?
Well, I think it is something about stepping away from the romantic fairy tales that we've seen. And like I say, I think LGBTQ plus people have done that a bit earlier, whereas I think you see a lot of heterosexual couples who've been really indoctrinated by the rom-coms and by the Valentine's cards and by the love songs. And I think there's a more fixed idea of what their wedding day, what their marriage, what all of their relationships, what all of their life is going to play out like. And so some of the heterosexual women that I've had on my podcast, it's someone like the brilliant Helen Thorne, who's spoken so wonderfully about her divorce. I think for someone like Helen, I was sort of in some ways taken aback at how it almost seemed like it was the first really traumatic and challenging and terrible event that had happened to her. Whereas, in a strange way, and this is sort of kind of sad in a way, I think all of my gay friends, queer friends, have developed a real resilience, because unfortunately, a lot of us have experienced homophobia, discrimination, even violence on a fairly regular basis, particularly my trans friends now. They're getting sort of hassle in the streets publicly, all the time. So in some ways, you're sort of used to difficult things happening and overcoming them. And in some ways, this is why I sort of have grown to sort of love breakups and love adversity a little bit, because I'm really interested in that bit afterwards, when you reinvent yourself and put yourself back together, and the real sort of febrile but very vibrant and colourful energy of that time. And I do think we now see a lot of my heterosexual friends like Helen sort of discovering that energy in that time, and really reveling in it and enjoying that sense of reawakening. But I think there is a real difference in how I think gay people approach adversity, because we're sort of used to it, which is quite a bit sad in a way, but in another way it means we've built resilience already.
Yeah, I mean, I'm really struck by one of the things I do like about your book and your podcast. And so the subtitle of the book is The Unexpected Joy of Heartbreak.
Yeah.
And I've mentioned on this podcast a lot is that we really like when we can have positive stories, because a lot of what we do is frankly pretty depressing, and people are going through really crappy times, and it's really hard, and there's the grief cycle which is associated with divorce and things. So having that kind of positive spin on it, and it is absolutely sad that if it comes from a place of, well, I've already experienced some terrible things in my life and some awful situations, so this is another one, rather than it being the kind of defining first, led a pretty charmed existence really, and and there's that trauma. And people do speak very positively. I mean, what's the sort of, are there common themes that you pick up from all your guests of this, the kind of the joy that comes from? You talked a little bit about the kind of self-discovery and things, and what people do with that. How does that kind of come across from other people that you've spoken to?
I just think there is a freedom to having that time and that headspace. And so many of us, when we get into a relationship, we don't necessarily pursue our own individual goals with quite the same force and energy and gusto, because we can't, because a relationship takes work. And if we have kids, if we have pets, if we have elderly relatives to care about, there's all kinds of things that you're managing as a team, running a home together. So I do think that maintaining that relationship over a long period of time is tough, and human beings are annoying and frustrating, and I try to be quite honest about all of that too, and the realities of being in a relationship, which is often far removed from the sort of romantic Valentine's card rom-com narrative. So I do think it's interesting to sort of show all of that and have some fun with it and play with it, because I think I've heard from people who are like, oh my god, I stopped going out with kind of boozy men and realized actually I really liked the outdoors and training and getting super fit, and I was a sort of party girl knocking back 10 cocktails a night, and now I'm like a triathlete, so it's a lot of people who've done really amazing things that has sort of stretched them, and they've achieved things they didn't know that they could or would. And so I think we live in this culture, particularly in the Western world, where having a relationship is seen, and getting married and having children and sort of following that life path is sort of seen as a real accolade, as the sort of ultimate achievement. It's a goal, isn't it, to have a successful relationship? Particularly if you're a woman, that seems like the most important thing. Even now, when we have obviously women who have incredibly successful careers, but that has only been a fairly modern development. I mean, when my mum was teaching, she it was very difficult for her when she took maternity leave, and she actually told my dad she would only ever have one child, because having more than that would be too disruptive for her career, because there was no real understanding then of maternity leave and that kind of thing. So that's why I'm an only child. I'm not going to
No, I can definitely relate though, because I can remember it's sort of, once you've been in a relationship for a couple of years, suddenly it's like, when are you going to get married? When are you going to get married? Particularly from the older relatives. And then you get married and it's when you're going to have a baby, when you're going to have a baby. And then you have a baby, and then it's when you're going to have another one. It's like, oh, I've just given birth to this one. Like, give me a chance. Although if you have a third, that shocks them all, because then it's like, wow, we weren't expecting that.
Whoa, slow down.
Yeah.
But like, blokes don't get that. I've never had that. Me and Anna, my wife, we were together for quite a long. We were together for ages, and we were together for quite a long time before we got married. And she would get the occasional question, and our families aren't that way, so we've not had super duper pressure. But from speaking to my female colleagues and female friends, they get it in that way that no blokes do in
it's still, there's still
relationships.
Such a difference, isn't there, in the way, like you say, the conversations that we have. But I was just so fascinated that when I got married, so many people on Facebook kind of liked my post about that, and I just thought, oh my god, I wish that many people liked my posts when my book came out, or when my podcast won an award, or when I'd achieved kind of career stuff that was, my marriage, of course, is important to me, but actually the relationship and meeting my partner, my wife, before she became my wife. That was the important thing. The fact that I met somebody great and we got together. To me, marriage is, I suppose, because I've not had access to it and not thought it'd be something that I did, but to me, actually getting married isn't so much of a big deal. But I was fascinated by thousands of likes and comments and and I thought, gosh, it doesn't to me feel like the biggest achievement that I've ever kind of got to in my life. But people still see it as this kind of pinnacle, and I suppose that's why we see it as this crashing failure if it ends. And I really have talked a lot in the book about how we need to move away from those success and failure binaries and those narratives and sort of goodies and baddies in a divorce, because it's complicated.
It is. And when you think about it, when going back, probably when we're talking about till death do you part with marriage, that those are kind of the vows that we do. Obviously, when all this came about, life expectancy was probably, you were lucky if you got to 35. We weren't seeing people that were sort of getting to 90, 100, 105. And therefore, the expectation now is if you met somebody at 25, that you are going to be married and in love with the same person. And it's all going to be rom-com and ideal and wonderful as you sort of sail off into retirement. It's just bizarre that we still place that pressure on ourselves, though, isn't it? And that we do view the breakup of a marriage as being a negative and being a failure, when actually, we go through so many different stages of our life, and it's almost like to expect us to be with the same person through each of those stages. Actually, you're just really lucky if that works and that you're able to grow together through those stages.
Really, really lucky. And I would say that growing apart is still growth, and that's, I think, really important. And sometimes you will grow apart because your paths are just going in different directions. And if you can recognize that and communicate about it effectively and consciously and compassionately, well, that's probably just as much of a success as that relationship that goes on and on. I mean, and I also tend to look a lot at the science and psychology and ask some of the experts about what is actually going on in the brain. And chemically, it's pretty much impossible to stay what we think of as in love for that long period of time over several decades, like you're talking about. You will move into a more companionate stage of love where there are different chemical processes going on in our bodies and in our brains, so we won't feel quite so compelled to be with that person all the time and think about that person all the time. And sometimes we view that as sort of falling out of love. We are just moving into a different stage of love. But if we miss some of the highs of first meeting somebody, then that's when you perhaps see people opening up their relationships or going swinging.
That's the sign to watch out for. So, I mean, Rosie, you make divorce and separation in the LGBTQ plus community sound like something quite desirable and lovely and everyone's friend. And I'm sure that's very far from the case. And I have some same-sex divorces at the moment that aren't quite that smooth, to put it mildly. So, but I guess there are different challenges given the different sort of structures of the community and the different sort of it doesn't conform to the heteronormative ideal. So, what are the extra challenges, whether it's around reaction in the community or family support, or what are the sort of particular problems that might arise more so in divorce in the community than perhaps outside that community?
I think there are a lot of different challenges. Some will be the same. We'll go through the same kind of grieving processes as anybody else. I think it's also worth understanding that marriage is relatively new. And so a lot of people might have rushed into it with some excitement because we could.
Yeah.
And so there may
new toy, you got to give this a try.
Yeah, exactly. So there may be some couples who realise that, it wasn't the right thing. And so, that there might be some people who've not had that same kind of long period of thinking about it and that same sort of reflection about whether it's really the right thing. But I think, like you say, you mentioned sort of family support and that kind of thing, and we might still see some LGBT people who don't have the same biological traditional family networks. So it may be a case of thinking about language when you're sort of talking to clients who are part of that community, and thinking about how you sort of ask about what support there is, because it may be a different type of setup. It may be more based around friendships and indeed ex-partners than necessarily parents and sort of biological relatives, and the people we would assume in a more sort of heteronormative setup might be the people to kind of step in and scoop you up and give you a bit of support. It might just be a slightly different set of people. Yeah, I also think that, the reasons for a relationship ending may be different, because we may have different ways of, even though we no longer have to have reasons for divorce, there may be different ways of thinking about things like adultery and infidelity, because we've already, as we've discussed, thought outside of the box a little bit. And so, and there's still lots of room for miscommunication and misunderstanding about areas like infidelity, but it is often a huge reason for a relationship ending. In the book, I sort of talk about the sort of top reasons for a breakup, and sex is pretty much up there as one of the top ones, whether it's the couple not having sex anymore, or whether it's someone having sex with somebody else, and so on. So there's lots of reasons why sex can really be incredibly problematic. But within our community, there might be more open discussion of things like asexuality, or even people with identities that are more fluid throughout a relationship. You may find that a partner has transitioned or altered their gender identity in some way, the way that they have decided to present themselves, and that can then obviously impact the relationship in significant ways. I remember speaking to my trans friend Deborah Jane Appleby, who many years ago, when she was assigned a male identity at birth, she then grew up and was seen in the world as male, and she married a woman. And before the Gender Recognition Act had come in, when she transitioned, they actually had to get divorced. It's bizarre, isn't it?
So they had to get divorced legally, but they remained in the couple. And
well, no, they didn't. They didn't in that scenario, actually. But
because I have heard of that being necessary, is because of the way the Gender Recognition Act works, is that suddenly a divorce is, you can't be married anymore. It's, the law, not, legally you can't be married. And I have spoken to people who, one of them has transitioned and their partner's been perfectly happy with that, but they've had to get divorced, which is again a recognition of how our laws can't keep up with society, because laws are going to reflect society at a greater or lesser speed, and sometimes that pace of change is absolutely glacial. But I think the changes in terms of people's sexual identity have happened, and the law just, sometimes you go, oh yeah, that's an unexpected consequence of something that wouldn't have been in the mind of the lawmakers at the time.
Absolutely. And I mean, we see couples who got together as a heterosexual couple in inverted commas, and then maybe one of them transitions and they sort of become a same-sex couple. So there's lots of interesting and, like you say, complicated scenarios going on now that in a very human way make sense to everybody involved. But like you say, in terms of the law and when that was all written, don't always fit so neatly into the boxes that you need. So yeah.
And lawyers like neat boxes, like that's what we live for. So
we love a form.
Oh, it's a form. Just make everyone just follow the rules and procedures. God, lawyers are boring.
And I suppose probably the other thing, just a kind of lovely fun thing, because I'm just looking at my dog. The other thing that I'm sure will be a huge thing for everybody, but especially for same-sex couples. For many of us, we haven't necessarily had human babies, but our pets are our babies. So I would anticipate within our community more than ever there's being some fierce pet custody battles. And I think, whenever we have a row, my wife and I think, well, I can't leave because she will keep the dog. So
Well, we had a chat about this on Monday, so there's going to be an episode coming out on nuptial agreements, and we had a chat about pet nups. Um, so yeah, it's been on the radar.
Yeah, definitely. Fur babies, fights over fur babies.
yeah, and I would imagine that they will be particularly intense within our community because our pets have almost taken on extra significance because many of us, certainly sort of my generation of gay women, have felt very sad perhaps that we haven't had the same choices available to us in terms of motherhood. And so those fur babies are really are our babies.
Yeah. I mean, I guess this is a huge topic and is something that we will be talking about also in this series, so we won't touch on it in a huge amount, but just maybe a little bit of comment then about surrogacy and kind of and alternative ways of having a family in a non-heterosexual relationship. Obviously, that is quite a complicated legal process, of which I will freely admit I know zero, but Lisa is very good at this sort of stuff. And obviously, that's going to, that must be something that crops up in the community, less so on Breakup, obviously, but, the changes and the developments in kind of surrogacy laws is something that's had a huge impact on the abilities of, lesbian couples to parent, gay couples to parent.
Yes, definitely. But I think also, again, worth bearing in mind that certainly for my sort of generation, there's still a class issue there because things like IVF, not cheap.
It's expensive. Yeah, it's expensive. And, if we talk about going and having a surrogacy arrangement in the US, which is quite a popular destination, I mean, you have to have, it's not about having £5,000-10,000. You have to have £150,000 to be able to make that work. So there are still a huge number of barriers. And, it's very unlikely that funding will be available on the NHS. People are having to fund these procedures themselves. And it's really costly. So absolutely, it's still a barrier for a lot of people.
Yeah.
It's been absolutely fascinating speaking to you, Rosie, and finding out. It's been quite informative for me to find out about a lot of things I don't really know about the LGBTQ community. We always like to finish our podcast with some sort of practical advice or some, a bit of positivity, which is very much your bag, obviously. I just wonder if you could just kind of, maybe give some hints for someone who's going through a breakup now, who's in the community, things that they might want to think about, things or resources or places they can go, places they can get support. If you could just give a little bit of advice to anyone who's hearing this thinking, oh God, I've got to go through the whole separation thing.
Yeah, well, it's a difficult time. And yes, if you are out there going through this, then I'm sorry that you're in this difficult time just for the moment. But it definitely will pass. I know it sounds cliche, doesn't it? But I think, all the things that anyone would do really are really appropriate, as in reaching out to friends and getting out there and going out and doing things that you enjoy, giving yourself treats and rewards. And that could be chocolate and lovely cakes, but it could also be going for a swim. I know a lot of people who found sort of outdoor swimming, wild swimming, really mindful when they're going through a divorce, and doing any sort of form of exercise does get the blood pumping around. It does replace some of those sort of happy chemicals that our partners would have sort of triggered the release of, and now we need to sort of maybe do other things, maybe even go to some comedy, have a laugh, dancing, doing physical things and getting out and about if you can really will help sort of distract you from those negative thoughts about, were they the one, what am I going to do? And I do think that sometimes reminding ourselves of some of the negative things about the relationship as well as some of the positives can just help keep us on track about why it has ended, why we're doing this. I also think what can be an interesting downside to the fact that the LGBT communities are quite close, and we do often stay friends with ex-partners, is there's not always an available space to have a bit of a vent about your ex, and just kind of even in the most conscious breakups, we might have a moment where we just want to go, ugh, I hate them. We all have a moment, don't we? So, maybe you don't feel you can do that with some of your friends who are also friends with your ex. So, maybe you want to just find that space either with a therapist or divorce coach or somebody who's just not as connected to your immediate friendship group. And maybe you'll make new friends as well, sort of doing new activities. So I think sort of starting a new chapter is really the way to look at it, and look at that as an exciting thing, as well as, yes, a little bit scary and a little bit daunting, but for that very reason I wrote the first half of the Breakup Monologues book in a sort of backwards timeline and the second half in a forwards timeline, to really convey that sense that the end of something is actually the beginning of something new.
Oh, thank you so much. It's been a really enjoyable conversation. So thank you so much for coming on the podcast and speaking to us today. So that's it for this episode of Stowe Talks. Thanks for listening. You can find out more about the work Rosie does, including her books and podcasts, at rosiewilby.com. And don't forget to follow her on Twitter at Rosie Wilby and Instagram at Breakup Monologues. If you would like more information on our podcasts, head over to stowtalks.co.uk, and please rate, like, share and review this podcast where you can.